Around 100 BCE, in the Han imperial capital of Chang'an, a scholar named Sima Chan sat with a brush in his hand and a problem he could not resolve. The brush was loaded with ink made from pine soot and water, ground to a deep particular blackness on a stone that had been in use long enough to carry a slight groove at its center. He had been compiling the asterisk Shiji asterisk, the records of the grand historian, for years, gathering the lives of kings and generals, astronomers, and wandering philosophers, setting them down in the ordered columns of classical Chinese, so that something of them would persist past the edge of living memory. He was not a man who enjoyed uncertainty. His work required precision, the patient locating of sources, the careful weighing of one account against another. But when he reached the section on Lao Tzu, he found something he had not prepared for. He had found three separate accounts, not three versions of the same account, three genuinely distinct possibilities about who this person was, where he lived, and when. The first described a man named Li Er, a keeper of records at the Zhou court, who had eventually grown weary of the declining kingdom and gone west. The second pointed to a man named Lao Tzu, also from the state of Chu, a contemporary of Confucius. The third named a historian called Tan, who had lived more than a century after the other two, during the early years of the Zhou dynasty's last period. Sima Chan examined these three figures and found no reliable way to select among them. He set them down side by side in his text and offered, instead of a resolution, an honest shrug, the written equivalent of a man who has looked carefully at all available evidence and found that looking carefully has not, in this case, delivered an answer. This moment, a historian pausing over a half-finished column of characters, brush held still above the silk, is itself a kind of philosophical event. Sima Chan was trained to produce order from archival chaos, to give shape to lives that had left only fragments behind. That he could not do so here, and did not pretend otherwise, says something about the difficulty of the figure he was trying to locate. Lao Tzu, whichever of the three possibilities is nearest the truth, or whether the truth lies somewhere between them or entirely elsewhere, had left the archival record in exactly the condition one might expect of someone who had thought very deeply about the limits of naming. The name itself carries a particular tenderness. Lao Tzu means most directly old master. Some translators render it old child or ancient child, finding in the character a doubleness between great age and original innocence that the simpler translation loses. The name may have been a title conferred by students after his death, or it may have been used in his own time as a mark of respect for someone whose age had become, to those who knew him, something almost legendary, or it may have been an honorific attached to a composite, a figure assembled from several real lives by the tradition that needed him to be singular. None of this is settled. What can be said is that the name, in whichever direction one reads it, points not toward a young man in his prime, but toward someone who had already passed through the ordinary seasons of a life and arrived at something further. The birth legend preserved in certain traditions holds that Lao Tzu spent 81 years in his mother's womb before emerging into the world, already aged, already white-haired, already possessing the look of someone who had been sitting quietly with a very large question for a very long time. He was born, the story goes, beneath a plum tree, and the tree's name in Chinese Li became the family name he carried through his documented years. 81 years in the womb before a single step taken in the world. Whatever else this image is, it is not a birth story in the ordinary sense. It is a statement about wisdom. It is saying that the kind of understanding Lao Tzu carried was not acquired through activity, through striving or study, or the accumulation of experience in the usual manner. It arrived through the long stillness, through the slow patience of an interior waiting so extended that the world itself had aged considerably before the understanding was ready to meet it. In this, the birth legend encodes something that would run through every line of the text attributed to him. The ordinary assumption about wisdom, that it grows through effort, that one must go out and find it, that the young must become experienced and the inexperienced must become learned, is gently inverted. The deepest kind of knowing, the legend suggests, belongs to something older than striving and quieter than acquisition. It belongs to what remains when all of that has been set aside and the long stillness has been allowed to do its own work. Whatever the legends say, the life preserved in Sima Chan's careful uncertainty includes a more mundane and in some ways more interesting detail. The man believed to have composed the asterisk Tao Te Ching asterisk, or to have been its principal source, or to have been the figure around whom its verses gathered over time, held a specific position at the court of the Zhou dynasty. He was the keeper of the archives. This was not a ceremonial post. It meant responsibility for the royal library, for the astronomical records and the ritual texts and the philosophical documents that the Zhou court had been accumulating and preserving across its long history. He had access to some of the oldest writing that existed in the world of his time, records from the early Zhou period, and possibly earlier, texts dealing with divination and cosmology and the proper conduct of state rituals, works by thinkers whose names had already been lost before he was born, leaving only their words behind on strips of bamboo. There is something worth sitting with in the image of this man, old, patient, surrounded by the accumulated written intelligence of centuries, moving through the Zhou archives in the hours before dawn, when the court was quiet and the lamplight made the stacked records glow faintly in the darkness. He was reading texts that were ancient even to him. He was handling the thoughts of people who had been dead for 300 years, 400 years, longer, and he was doing so not as an exercise in preservation alone, but as an ongoing conversation, the kind of reading that changes the reader, that leaves marks not in the margin of the text, but in the thinking of the person who has taken the text seriously. What he found in those archives, what arguments he encountered there, what lines from earlier cosmological thinking shaped the direction of his own understanding. None of this is recoverable with certainty, but the fact of his access matters. When Lao Tzu eventually left, he was not leaving from outside the tradition. He was leaving from its most interior room. He had read the books. He had held the ritual texts, had studied the astronomical records, had absorbed the full weight of what the Zhou court regarded as its intellectual heritage. The departure that followed was not that of a man who had never been invited in. It was the departure of an insider who had considered the institution with full knowledge of its contents and had found, at the end of that consideration, that his direction lay elsewhere. The nature of that departure is one of the most durable images in the long history of Chinese thought. At some point, Sima Chan is vague on the timing, and the vagueness seems appropriate. Lao Tzu observed that the Zhou dynasty was failing, the kingdom was declining toward the long disorder that would eventually give rise to the Warring States period. The court that had commissioned and preserved his archives was losing its coherence, its central authority dissolving into competing powers and fractured loyalties. Lao Tzu looked at this and concluded that his time there was finished. He gathered what he needed. The accounts differ on what, exactly, an archivist takes with him when he leaves, and he headed west. He traveled on a water buffalo. This detail, preserved in the tradition with the kind of specificity that suggests it carries more than biographical weight, is itself a kind of statement. The water buffalo moves at the pace of a slow river. It does not hurry. It cannot be persuaded to hurry by anyone who understands its nature. To travel on a water buffalo through the mountain roads west of the zoo capital was to commit to arriving in the unhurried rhythm of the animal rather than the urgent rhythm of a man with somewhere important to be. The old archivist sat on this patient animal and moved west through the dusk, and the accounts agree, in their shared silence on this point, that he did not turn to look back at the city disappearing behind him. There is a road that leads west from what was once the zoo capital toward the mountain pass known as Hanggu Guan, the Hanggu Pass. It passes through terraced hillsides and river valleys, through country that was already old when Lao Tzu moved through it. The mountains on either side, carrying the particular silence of high places that have witnessed the full duration of human ambition and found it neither impressive nor contemptible, simply temporary. The road reaches the pass through a narrowing of the landscape, the mountains drawing close on either side, the path threading between them as through the gate of something much larger than any kingdom. This is the point where the civilization of the zoo world ended, where the mapped and administered territory of the dynasty gave way to the unnamed West. At this pass there was a gatekeeper. His name in the accounts is Yin Shi. He held the title of Guardian of the Pass, a man whose daily work was the registration of those who passed through, the levying of duties, the maintenance of the border between the known world and whatever lay beyond it. He was not, by all indications, an ordinary border official. The tradition describes him as someone with enough philosophical attunement that when he saw the old man approaching on the patient animal, he recognized, by some means that the accounts do not quite explain, that the traveler before him carried something worth stopping for. What Yin Shi had, perhaps, was the kind of attention that long years in a specific place can produce. A man who stands at a mountain pass long enough, watching the merchants and the diplomats and the soldiers and the wanderers and the refugees move through, eventually develops a sensitivity to the quality of a figure's presence that goes beyond the official categories of his work. He watched travelers arrive and pass through for years. He knew what ordinary passing through looked like. When this old man on this slow animal came down the mountain road toward the gate, something in the quality of the arrival was different enough that Yin Shi set aside the official transaction and made a different kind of request. He asked the old man to stop. He asked him, before continuing into the unnamed West, to write down what he knew. The request, understood in its full weight, is remarkable. A border official at the furthest edge of civilization asking an old man who is clearly leaving and does not intend to return to pause and record his understanding before it disappears with him into territory from which no one expected a report. What Yin Shi was recognizing, or what the story is saying through his recognition, is that something was about to be lost, not merely the presence of an aged scholar, but the specific understanding that he had assembled across a long life, which would not exist in that form anywhere else, and would not come again. The request is an act of a particular kind of care, not the care that asks someone to stay, the care that asks someone before they go to leave something of what they are. The old man sat down. The accounts vary on the surface he used, a rough wooden table, a stone shelf at the gate, the gatekeeper's own writing surface, but they agree on what happened next. Lao Tzu took up a brush and wrote. He wrote in the compressed tonal strokes of classical Chinese, each character dense with meaning, each phrase built to carry far more than its surface suggests. And he wrote, in this setting, 5,000 characters, not more. The asterisk Tao Te Ching, asterisk as it has come down through the centuries, is a very short text, 81 short verses, some of them only a few lines, none of them long, the whole of it together, fitting into what a modern reader would experience as a slim volume that takes perhaps 2 hours to read straight through. But its brevity is not scarcity. Each verse was written under the particular pressure of a man who had spent his working life with words and had arrived in his final act of writing at a clarity about how many were necessary. The writing was done at the edge of the world he had known. On one side of the gate, the Zhao dynasty, the archives, the accumulated ritual life of a civilization that had been shaping itself for centuries around the conviction that the right forms of conduct, the right observance of ceremony, the right relationship between rulers in heaven and the ordinary human life, all of this was knowable, teachable, and worth the immense effort of preserving. On the other side, nothing, the unnamed territory that no map of his era tracked with confidence. Into that nothing he was about to walk. And in between these two territories, in the thin space of the gatekeeper's post, he wrote what he knew, 5,000 characters, handed across the threshold to a man who would stay, by a man who would not. It is worth sitting for a moment with the condition of those 5,000 characters in the hours after Yin Shi received them. He was holding in the physical form of inscribed silk or bamboo strips the distillation of a life that had passed through the full archive of its civilization and had emerged with something to say that the archive itself did not quite contain. Not an addition to the existing records. The asterisk Tao Te Ching asterisk would not have fit among the Zhou court's astronomical tables, and ritual prescriptions would not have been catalogued easily among the philosophical texts Lao Tzu himself had spent years managing. It was something else, something that in some ways moved against the direction of all that accumulated official knowledge, that pointed not toward greater precision and categorization, but toward what lay beneath precision and categorization, beneath the whole project of naming and fixing and preserving. Yin Shi held these pages, and Lao Tzu turned west and walked forward into the territory that had no name. The moment of that crossing is where Sima Chan's account, and all subsequent accounts, in the historical record in any recoverable sense, stops. The old man on the water buffalo moves through the narrow gap between the mountains. The dusk light would have been failing on the western faces of the peaks, and the path beyond the gate would have been in deeper shadow than the path behind it. He would have been a figure diminishing in the gatekeeper's sight, the animal's patient rhythm carrying him steadily forward. The old man's back growing smaller against the mountain rock, and then a turning of the path or a gathering of shadow, and then nothing at all. This is where every tradition that has tried to follow him gives up the chase and stands still. The Buddhists have one account of where he went, westward, eventually to India, eventually becoming the teacher who would set in motion the tradition that would encounter Chinese culture centuries later and become something new in the encountering. The Taoists have their own accounts, most of them declining to locate him at all, treating the absence of a final destination as itself the appropriate ending of this particular life. Some accounts place his eventual death at an improbable age, 160 years, 200 years, several lifetimes stacked within the span of one, as if the tradition could not quite commit to the idea that what he represented had ever fully stopped. Sima Chan, the careful historian who began this whole accounting, ends his entry on Lao Tzu with a characteristic precision about his own limits. He does not know, he writes, whether Lao Tzu is any of the three figures he has described. He does not know where he went or how long he lived. He reports the departure, the text, and then the silence, and he holds that silence with the same care he has brought to every other fact, not filling it in with comfortable invention, not lamenting the gap, simply acknowledging that this is what the record contains, and that the record in this case is incomplete. For a historian of Sima Chan's ambition and method, this acknowledgement required a particular kind of intellectual courage. The asterisk, Shiji, asterisk is a text organized around the recoverable, around names and dates and documented events, around the persistence of the traceable through time. To write an entry that ends in acknowledged uncertainty, that sets down three possibilities and leaves them standing without resolution, was to do something the text does not do in the same way anywhere else. The uncertainty around Lao Tzu is not the uncertainty of lost records or inadequate sources, at least not entirely. It is the uncertainty produced by a figure who seems, by every indication the tradition preserves, to have had a deliberate relationship with elusiveness, a man who had spent a life in the archives and then walked away from them, a man who, when asked to leave something of himself behind, left something so dense and so open that centuries of scholarship have not yet exhausted its implications, and then who continued walking in a direction that no map of his era or ours can follow. The winter nights in the Hangu Pass region are cold in the way that mountain borderlands have always been cold. The air thin enough that sound carries differently, the wind moving through the gap between the peaks with the quality of something that has come a very long way without stopping. A traveler on a slow animal, wearing the plain clothing that the accounts consistently ascribe to him, would have felt that cold as a very direct and physical fact, not philosophical, simply cold, and the animal warm beneath him, and the path continuing forward through the darkening air. In the Zhou archives he had left behind, the lamps would have been lit by now. Someone else would be moving through those stacked records, checking the astronomical tables, reviewing the ritual prescriptions, maintaining the great effort of the civilization to remember what it knew and to pass it forward unchanged. The work of preservation continuing without him, the bureaucratic life of a court in slow decline, still producing its documents, still filing its records, still insisting on the categories and the proper procedures that had always organized its understanding of the world. And somewhere on the mountain road to the west, growing steadily more distant from all of that, the old man on the patient animal, moving in the direction of whatever the Tao itself is said to move, not toward a destination, not away from a failure, simply in the direction of the great and unnamed open. The text he left behind would survive him by more than 2,000 years. It would be copied and recopied on bamboo strips, on silk, on paper, in the handwriting of scholars who understood it and scholars who did not, in editions that varied from one another in ways that still occupy the specialized attention of those who have given their lives to the question of which version is most ancient, most accurate, closest to whatever Lao Tzu's brush actually inscribed at Yinshi's border post. Archaeological discoveries in the 20th century, texts found in the tombs of Han Dynasty nobles, buried with the careful deliberateness of people who wanted their afterlives to have access to important reading, pushed the textual history of the asterisk Tao Te Ching asterisk back further than many scholars had previously believed possible, confirming that the words Sima Chan's own readers would have known were already very old by the time they received them. None of this scholarly persistence changes the fundamental quality of the crossing. The gatekeeper received 5,000 characters. The old man turned west. The gap between the mountains swallowed the figure on the animal. The path continued. There is a quality that certain absences have, not the absence of something that should be there and is not, but the absence of something that was never fully in the category of what can be kept and located. The way a sound leaves a room without leaving a trace of where it went, but the room is different for having held it. The way a question, once genuinely asked, does not disappear when no answer arrives, but settles instead into the fabric of the thinking life, becoming part of the ground from which further questions grow. Lao Tzu, moving west through the Hangu Pass and into the undocumented territory, beyond it is that kind of absence, not a gap in the record, a presence that continued in a form the record was not designed to track. The 5,000 characters at Yinji's table are the last retrievable moment, the final place where the thinking life of this old archivist intersects with what historians can read and date and compare to other texts. After that, the path, the tradition that carries his name, has always been comfortable with this. More than comfortable, it has found in this ending something that feels right, something that matches what the text itself seems to be saying about the proper relationship between presence and disappearance, between the named and the nameable, between the world of fixed records and the living reality those records can only approximate. A teacher who leaves no final account of his destination is, in this light, not a historical problem, but a philosophical consistency. He went where the text said everything eventually goes, back into the open, back into what the tradition he founded would call, without being able to say exactly what it means, the source. Sima Qian, finishing his entry in the lamplight of the Han Imperial Archives, his brush loaded again with the dark ink, the fresh silk waiting. The next subject, already gathered at the edges of his attention, would have set down his uncertainty about Lao Tzu's identity and moved forward into the next chapter of the asterisk Shiji, asterisk. He was a thorough man. He had looked at what was available and reported it faithfully. The gap between the available and the complete was not his fault and not his concern, in the way that a careful surveyor does not apologize for the edge of the known territory as it appears on the maps he is drawing. But the gap itself remained, and it remains, and there is something in that persistence that has kept drawing readers and scholars and wanderers back to it for more than 2,000 years. The figure of Lao Tzu, old, patient, seated on a slow animal, moving without hurry toward the unnamed West, has become one of the most durable images in the long tradition of human thought, precisely because it is not quite pinned down, precisely because the final coordinates have never been established. Some of the most luminous presences in that tradition are there not because they built great institutions, or won decisive arguments, or left behind enough documents for the archivists, who came after them to construct a full biography. They are there because they followed their understanding all the way to the place where the maps ran out, and then continued and left behind only the faintest trace of a direction, just enough for those who came after to feel, standing at the same edge, something like the warmth of a presence that had passed this way before. The Hangu Pass is still there. The mountains on either side of it are still drawing close, in the way that mountains draw close along that road, the ancient gap between them, unchanged by the centuries of passage through it. The path that continues to the west on the far side of the gate is still a path, still leading toward territory that is mapped now in ways it was not in Lao Tzu's time, but which retains, in the nature of western horizons, seen from that particular elevation, something of the quality that the old archivist was walking toward. An openness, a continuation of the world beyond the edge of the administered, the categorized, the archived. the place where the water buffalo's slow footsteps would have made their soft impressions in the road's dust, and the wind would have covered them, and after a short time there would have been no trace that anyone had passed, and the mountains would have returned to their long and patient silence, holding as they have always held the full weight of the sky. Somewhere in a room that may have been lit by a single oil lamp, or may have been open to the cooling air of an evening that has long since passed, a man formed a sentence that immediately undid itself. The first character arrived on the silk, or the bamboo, or the air between his lips, the character for Tao, the way, the word the Chinese language had used for road and river course, and the proper path of a king, so word solid enough in its ordinary life to carry people and water and governance without straining. Then the second character arrived beside it, then the third, and by the time the first three characters had settled into place, they had said something that no one had quite said before, in quite this way, which was, the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. The sentence opened with the thing it claimed to name, and then with its next breath dissolved the name it had just made. It was not a riddle, it was not a performance of mystical cleverness. It was a man setting down, as carefully and plainly as he could, something he had noticed, after a very long time of noticing, that whatever the deepest ground of things might be, the word for it was not the thing, and this distinction, once genuinely held, rather than merely acknowledged, changed the way almost everything looked, not all at once, but steadily, and without return. The problem that sentence was trying to solve is not a difficult one to feel, even if it resists being solved. Anyone who has tried to describe a piece of music to someone who has not heard it, or to say what it was like to stand at the edge of an ocean for the first time, or to explain to another person exactly what it feels like to wake in the middle of the night from a dream that was full of significance and is already dissolving. Anyone who has tried these things has arrived, briefly, at the same wall the sentence arrived at. Language fixes. Language takes something that flows and gives it edges. It takes something that exists in a continuous unfolding process and makes it a noun, stable and locatable, available for pointing at. This is what language is for, and it is very useful, and it is precisely the wrong instrument for what Lao Tzu was trying to point at. The Tao, as he understood it, was not a thing. It was the condition from which things arose. It was prior to naming, not because it was ancient in the way an old stone is ancient, but because name-giving presupposes a world of distinct separable objects, and the Tao was what existed before that presupposition was made. The scholar who reads those first three characters aloud in classical Chinese, in a quiet room, finds that the sounds themselves carry something of this quality. The characters are tonal, compressed, dense, each syllable folded with the weight of centuries of use, and when they land in the air and the room goes still afterward, the silence that follows is not the absence of sound, but something else, something that was there before the sounds arrived and is still there after they leave. Whether that quality belongs to classical Chinese, or to the verse itself, or to what happens when a person genuinely attends to the claim the verse is making, is a question that might remain open without loss. The experience is the teaching. The teaching is that the room after the last syllable is larger than the room before it. Lao Tzu did not leave the question there. The first chapter of the Tao Te Ching moves from the impossibility of naming the eternal Tao into a second related distinction, which is between two modes of whatever the Tao is. In one mode, it is the nameless, unmanifest ground from which everything arises, the deep quiet before form, the open stillness before differentiation. In another mode, it is present in the named world, The 10,000 things, the vast proliferation of particular beings and objects and processes that constitute visible, tangible, experiential reality as most people know it. The tree is one of the 10,000 things. The river is one of the 10,000 things. A grief, a government, a grain of sand, a dynasty, all of these are among the 10,000 things. They are not separate from the Tao. They arise from it, the way shapes arise from clay. But they are also not the whole of it, the way the shapes are not the whole of clay, and are not what clay is before it is shaped. The 10,000 things are the Tao in its particular, formed, nameable mode. The eternal, unmanifest ground is the Tao in its prior, formless mode. And what Lao Tzu was noticing was that most human attention, including the attention of the most careful and learned people he knew, was so thoroughly absorbed in the 10,000 things that the ground from which they arose had become nearly invisible, a silence lost beneath the noise of its own productions. This is where the image of the uncarved block arrives, and it arrives not as a metaphor, but as a physical fact about wood, before it becomes anything else. An uncarved block of cedar sits on a craftsman's workbench in morning light. Its grain runs in long, unhurried lines from one end to the other. Its surface is smooth in the way that surfaces are smooth before they have been worked, which is not the smoothness of polished things, but the smoothness of things that have not yet been interrupted. Within that block, in some entirely real sense, is everything it could become: a bowl, a shelf, a door, a fire, the handle of an instrument, the frame of a window, the leg of a table, smoke, and then heat, and then ash. None of these things is actual yet. All of them are present as pure potential. The craftsman who picks up a chisel will make one of them actual and foreclose all the others, which is a perfectly ordinary and necessary thing to do, and the bowl that results will be a beautiful bowl, and this is not a loss to mourn. But the block before the chisel arrives holds something the bowl will not hold, which is the uninterrupted presence of all possibilities simultaneously. This is what the Chinese word pu, names, often translated as the uncarved block, or sometimes as raw simplicity or original nature. And what Lao Tzu was pointing at when he used it was the state of anything, human or cosmic, before social conditioning and ambition and the accumulated weight of specific choices have shaped it into one particular limited form. The return to pu is not a rejection of form or a refusal of the 10,000 things. It is the recovery of the original ground beneath them, the open potential that existed before the first chisel fell. The craftsman's hands are warm where they rest against the block. The grain runs under his fingers. He holds the chisel and pauses. The pause is not hesitation. It is something closer to recognition, a moment in which the block is still entirely itself, and he is attending to what it is before deciding what to make it. That pause, Lao Tzu would have said, is closer to the Tao than anything that follows. There is a chapter in the Tao Te Ching, the 6th chapter, very brief, almost breathless in its compression, that describes the Tao through an image that surprised many of its early readers and continues to surprise people now, which is the image of a valley, not a mountain, not a great river, not a sky full of stars, a valley. The Tao is described here through the phrase that translates roughly as valley spirit, or the spirit of the hollow place, and it is described as deathless, and as the root of heaven and earth, and as inexhaustible. Draw from it all you like, and it continues to give. The word that sits beneath this image, the quality that the valley embodies, and that makes it the right image for the Tao in this passage, is a feminine word. The valley does not project, it receives. It does not command, It holds. It is the low place, not the high place, the place that everything drains into, that gathers and retains and quietly sustains. This is not a secondary quality in the Tao Te Ching. Lao Tzu returns to it again and again, the low and the receiving and the maternal, as the qualities most characteristic of the Tao's fundamental nature. The heroic, the commanding, the high and outward projecting, these are the qualities of the 10,000 things in their particular asserting mode. The Tao that underlies them all is described in this passage and in others as older than assertion, deeper than any projection, inexhaustibly generative in the way that only a ground can be generative, not because it produces by effort, but because production is what happens when things flow through it freely. A valley at night receives everything that moves through it without resisting any of it. The sound of an owl settles into it and is held. The sound of a stream runs through it and is held. The wind moves across its face and passes, and the valley remains as receptive after the wind as it was before. It does not accumulate what it receives in the way a container accumulates water. It is not filled up. It simply holds openly whatever arrives, and when the sound passes, the valley is no less a valley for its passing, and when the sound arrives, the valley is no more a valley than it was in the silence. This is the valley spirit. This is the deathless, inexhaustible quality that Lao Tzu was pointing at when he chose, of all possible images, the hollow place. The question of what kind of thing the Tao actually is, whether it is a being, or a force, or a principle, or a ground, or something for which none of these words are quite right, is a question the Tao Te Ching deliberately does not answer. The text is not being evasive. It is enacting through its own structure the very position it is trying to communicate. The Tao is that which precedes all categories, including the category of thing. To ask what kind of thing it is would be to have already missed the direction the question is pointing. What Lao Tzu seems to have understood, through however many decades of observing the natural world and human affairs, and his own mind moving through them, is that the categories through which ordinary understanding grasps reality are real and useful but partial. They work very well for navigating the world of the 10,000 things, and they work very poorly for attending to the ground beneath that world. The move the Tao Te Ching is constantly making is not to provide a new and better category for ultimate reality, but to loosen the listener's grip on categories altogether, briefly, just enough to let a different kind of attending become possible. This is why the text so often approaches the Tao through negation. Not this, not that, not what you are reaching for when you reach with your ordinary mind. And why this negation, when it lands well, does not feel like a door closing, but like a window opening. There is a chapter, the 11th, that has stayed in circulation for 2,500 years, because it manages to say something very difficult in entirely concrete, physical terms, using 3 objects that anyone who has ever used a wheel, or a cup, or stood in a room has encountered. A wheel, Lao Tzu observes, is made of 30 spokes, converging on a hub at the center. The spokes are the visible, tangible, measurable part of the wheel, the part a craftsman cuts and fits and shapes and can point to. But the place at the center where they converge, the hollow through which the axle runs, is empty. There is nothing there in the ordinary sense of the word nothing. And yet it is precisely this nothing, this empty hub, that makes the wheel a wheel rather than 30 sticks lying on the ground. Without the hollow center, the wheel cannot turn. Without the turning, there is no wheel in any functional sense, only wood arranged in a particular way. The emptiness is not the absence of something that should be there. It is the structural condition of the wheel's capacity to do what a wheel does. Then Lao Tzu says, a potter shapes clay into a vessel. The walls and the base are the visible, shaped thing, the thing with weight and texture and a particular form. But the hollow interior is what makes it a vessel rather than a lump of clay in a different shape. The hollow is the vessel's capacity to hold, to give, to be used. Then he says, a room is built with walls and a floor and a roof, and these are the substantial materials, the wood and plaster and stone that can be touched and pointed to and assigned a price. But it is the emptiness of the room, the unoccupied space inside the walls, that makes the room habitable. Without the empty interior, there is no room. There is only the frame of one. A potter's hands shape wet clay on the wheel, pressing in and drawing up, making the walls thin and even. The moment when the hollow exists, the moment when the interior space becomes a real interior, enclosed and continuous from base to rim, is the moment when the bowl becomes a bowl. Before that moment, there is clay being shaped. After it, there is a vessel. The transformation is not in the clay. The clay has been there throughout. The transformation is in the nothing, in the hollow that now exists, where before there was only more clay. In that moment, what appeared to be nothing became the most essential presence in the room. This is not a poetic observation about the nature of bowls, or not only that. It is a claim about the structure of reality, that the formless, empty prior dimension of things is not the least important part of them, but in some deep sense the most important. And this connects directly to the Tao. If the Tao is the formless ground from which the 10,000 things arise, it is not less than those things, the way the hollow of the bowl is not less than the clay walls that surround it. It is what makes those things possible, what holds their capacity to exist and function and be what they are. The named world, the world of forms and objects and particular beings, rests on an unnamed ground, the way the walls of a vessel rest on the hollow they were made to protect. This principle has a name in the Tao Te Ching, which is Wu, often translated as nothing, or non-being, or emptiness, and it sits in productive tension throughout the text, with another character Yu, meaning being, or presence, or form. Lao Tzu does not privilege one over the other, or argue that emptiness is more real than form. The two arise together, as the text says, being and non-being produce each other. The wheel cannot function without both the spokes and the hub. The vessel cannot hold without both the walls and the hollow. The room cannot be inhabited without both the structure and the space it encloses. What the text is undoing is not the value of form, but the assumption that form is where all the value lies, the ordinary, unreflected assumption that the substantial, visible, nameable parts of things are the whole of those things, and that the empty, invisible, unnamed parts are merely the absence of something better. Once that assumption loosens, the wheel looks different, the room looks different. The silence between two sounds, the pause between two breaths, the space between two spoken words. These things look different, or rather, they begin to be noticed at all. A wheel turns on a cart moving along a river road. The spokes blur in the turning until they are almost invisible, and what remains most clearly visible is the dark, empty circle at the center, moving steadily forward through the morning, the road passing beneath it, the river running alongside. An observer watching from the bank would see the wheel turn and the cart move, and might focus on the wooden spokes and the iron rim and the load the cart is carrying, all of which are real, all of which are present, all of which matter for the cart's purpose. And in the middle of all that turning, At the center of the visible and the functional, a piece of emptiness is doing the most essential work. What Lao Tzu seems to have arrived at, through attention rather than argument, is that this quality, the formless, prior receptive ground, is not a special property of wheels and bowls and rooms. It is a property of everything, present everywhere, most visible in those moments when attention rests long enough to notice what ordinary attention moves past. The ancient Chinese had words for this quality that are difficult to carry whole into English. The word shaun appears in the first chapter of the Tao Te Ching and is sometimes translated as mystery, sometimes as profound, sometimes as dark or deep. It names the quality of something that cannot be looked at directly, the way one looks at stars by looking slightly away from them, because the center of the eye cannot hold faint light. The Tao is shaun in this sense, not mysterious as a puzzle is mysterious, awaiting solution. Mysterious as the sky on a clear night is mysterious, immense and available, given freely to any attention willing to stay with it, and not reducible to whatever one says about it afterward. There is a related word that the text uses when it wants to say that the Tao is not an object located somewhere and not a quality located in things, but the very ground of their being. The word is ziren, which means self-so or naturally so, or the condition of something simply being what it is without any external cause, compelling it to be that way. A tree grows toward light. It does not decide to grow toward light. It does not follow a rule that says trees must grow toward light. It simply is the kind of thing that grows toward light, and this growing is its nature expressing itself freely, without strain or coercion, in the direction that is native to it. This is ziren, and the Tao, being the ground of all natures, is ziren in the most complete sense. It is simply what it is, without anything behind it or above it, compelling it to be otherwise. There is no creator in the Taoist cosmology standing behind the Tao and issuing instructions. There is only the Tao unfolding in its own nature, which is the nature of spontaneous, unforced, inexhaustible generation. The uncarved block sits in the morning light. The grain runs through it slowly, end to end, in the unhurried record of the tree's growth over years that no one counted. Every possibility is present in it, and none is actual. The craftsman has not yet arrived. The workshop is quiet in the way that workshops are quiet before the day's work begins, not empty, because the tools are there, and the materials are there, and the light is coming in through a high opening, but undisturbed, still in the quality of its own original arrangement, before any particular thing has been made. This is what the uncarved block holds, that the finished bowl will not hold. Not some mystical property that carving destroys, simply the state of potentiality, the open, undivided, unhurried state of the thing before the particular becomes actual, and everything else it could have been falls away. Lao Tzu seems to have found this quality not only beautiful, but instructive. The return to the state of the uncarved block is not, in his thinking, a nostalgic wish to undo all the work human culture and human individual development have done. It is a direction of attention, a practice of returning, in some inner sense, to the original ground beneath all the accumulated shapes one has been given, or given oneself. The sage who has made this return does not stop being a particular person with a particular history and particular knowledge, but something in them has re-established contact with the ground from which all particularity arises, and this contact changes the quality of everything they do, not in the way that learning a new technique changes the quality of a craftsman's work, in the quieter, less visible way that a craftsman who is at ease with their materials differs from one who is fighting them. The difference in the work is real and evident to anyone who looks carefully, and the source of it is not skill, but something prior to skill. Chapter 6 says the valley spirit never dies. The words are few, and the claim is enormous. What does it mean for a spirit, for a quality, a principle, an inexhaustible ground of generation, to be deathless? Not that it continues indefinitely in the way that a stone or a river continues, because both stones and rivers have ends, erosion and evaporation, and the slow defeat of all persistence. Deathless, in the sense that the Tao precedes the distinction between alive and not alive, the way a hollow precedes the distinction between full and empty. The hollow of the bowl is not alive. It is also not dead. It is prior to that distinction, holding the capacity for both. The valley spirit is deathless, the way that capacity is deathless, not because it survives, but because surviving and not surviving are categories that arise within, rather than being applicable to it. This is the kind of thinking that requires a particular quality of attention to follow, which is not the sharp focusing category building attention that ordinary intellectual work demands, but something more like the attention one brings to watching light move across a wall, open, patient, receiving rather than pursuing, content to let what arrives arrive without rushing ahead to name it. The Tao Te Ching was written for people capable of this quality of attention, and reading it carefully is one practice that develops it, which may be why the text has persisted across so many centuries and so many cultures that were not the culture that produced it. It is less a set of propositions to be evaluated than an instrument for cultivating a particular quality of awareness, and the propositions it contains are in the service of that cultivation rather than the other way around. A valley in the dark receives the sound of water moving through it. The sound arrives and moves through the valley, and the valley is unchanged by its passing, not unaffected, but unchanged in its fundamental nature, in its capacity to receive the next sound and the next without filling up, without narrowing, without losing whatever it was before the first sound arrived. The owl calls from somewhere on the eastern slope. The stream answers from below. The wind comes and moves across the upper air, and the valley holds all of it. And when the wind has passed and the owl has gone quiet, and the stream continues alone in the dark, the valley is still entirely a valley, still entirely hollow, still entirely open to whatever the night will bring next. The first verse of the Tao Te Ching was not written to be solved. It was written to be entered. The man who formed those first three characters, whatever his name was, whatever the hour was, whatever the surface under his brush or the air in his lungs, was not providing an answer to the question of what reality ultimately is. He was offering a direction of attention. The direction is inward and downward toward the ground that everything stands on, the hollow that every fullness surrounds, the silence that every sound moves through and leaves behind. This direction does not lead to a destination, because destinations are among the 10,000 things, and the Tao is what those things arise from and return to, not a place one arrives at. What it leads to is a quality of attention, patient, open, receiving, unhurried. The quality of the valley, the quality of still water, the quality of the uncarved block before the first chisel falls. The hollow of the bowl is the bowl's capacity to hold. It is not made of anything. It cannot be touched or weighed or pointed to with the same directness as the clay walls surrounding it. And yet a bowl without it is not a bowl. It is a lump, the capacity to receive, the capacity to hold, the empty space at the center of things that makes the things what they are, This is what Lao Tzu spent a long life attending to, and what he left behind in 5,000 compressed tonal, careful characters was not a description of that capacity, but a practice of noticing it, a gentle, persistent redirecting of attention toward the ground that most attention moves past in its pursuit of the formed and the nameable and the particular. The bowl sits, the hollow holds. What appears to be nothing remains, quietly and without effort, the most essential presence in the room. A river does not decide to flow. That fact, as plain as it is, sits at the center of something Lao Tzu returned to again and again in the 5,000 characters he left behind, not as a metaphor selected for effect, as an observation made by someone who had watched water long enough to understand that its particular genius, its capacity to carve stone, to fill every hollow, to reach the sea without ever having planned the route, comes precisely from what it does not do. It does not force. It does not resist. It does not hold a preference for one channel over another. It simply moves according to its nature, and because it does, nothing in the landscape can stop it for long. The teaching that grew from that observation has a name, 2 syllables in classical Chinese, each carrying a weight that the English language struggles to distribute evenly across any combination of its own words. Wu Wei. The first character, Wu, means without. The second, Wei, carries a broad range of meaning: action, effort, deliberate striving, the kind of doing that is driven by will and calculation and the desire for a particular outcome. Together they point towards something that is not in action, not withdrawal, not the simple absence of movement. They point toward action that is free from forcing, engagement with the world that moves with the grain of things rather than across it. To feel the difference, it helps to watch the river for a while before reaching for the concept. There is a particular moment that occurs on any river of sufficient size, at any bend where the current has been running for centuries. The water arrives at the obstacle, a boulder pushed into the streambed by some ancient collapse of hillside stone, and it does not slow in the way a person slows when encountering something unwanted. The water simply becomes the shape that the obstacle requires. It splits. The 2 channels it makes around the stone are not a compromise or a defeat. They are the natural expression of what water does in the presence of that particular form of resistance. Further downstream, the 2 channels rejoin. The river is whole again, and the stone, harder than anything the river can throw against it, is over centuries fractionally smaller than it was. Nothing was forced. Nothing was wasted. The stone does not know it is losing, and the river does not know it is winning, and the word winning belongs to a different kind of story than the one the river is living. Lao Tzu was watching that story when he wrote what he wrote, or something like it. He had, according to the accounts that survive, spent years in the archives of the Zhou court, moving among records that were ancient even when he read them, ritual texts and astronomical observations, and the accumulated administrative weight of a civilization managing its own complexity. He had seen what happened to institutions that tried to hold their shape against the current of circumstance. He had watched the Zhou dynasty work to maintain by force what it had once maintained by the natural authority of a government that had not yet needed to announce itself. He had seen, in other words, the difference between the river and the person trying to dam it with their hands. The departure he eventually made west through the mountain pass on a water buffalo whose pace nothing in his manner seemed to hurry was itself an enactment of the principle he would later be asked to record. He was not fleeing, he was not declaring defeat. He was moving when movement was what the moment required. through the threshold that opened when the season of his court life had completed itself, carrying nothing in his hands that the road ahead would not provide. Wu Wei is most accurately understood as supremely responsive action. The emphasis belongs on that word, responsive, because what Lao Tzu was describing was not the philosopher who withdraws from the world and calls the withdrawal wisdom. He was describing something much harder to achieve than withdrawal, a state of engagement so complete, so finely tuned to the actual conditions of the moment, that the effort required becomes invisible, even to the one doing it. The sailor who reads the wind and makes the small adjustment to the rudder, the barely perceptible tilt of the hand, so that the boat continues moving in its intended direction without a single pull against the current. That sailor is not passive. That sailor is more continuously and precisely attentive to conditions than any amount of straining at the oars would require. The misreading of the teaching has been common enough and persistent enough that it is worth naming plainly. Wu Wei, read quickly or read through the lens of a culture that values visible effort and measurable output as the signals of seriousness, can look like an argument for doing nothing, for letting things take care of themselves, for a kind of philosophical drift that mistakes inattention for wisdom. That reading misses almost everything. What Lao Tzu was pointing toward was not the absence of action, but a particular quality of action, the quality that belongs to movement, that has found its alignment with the current of circumstances and therefore does not require force to sustain itself. A craftsman comes close to it in the moments when the work is going well, the hands moving through the final stages of shaping something on a wheel do not consult a plan. They respond. The clay tells the hands what it needs, and the hands listen, and from the outside the work appears to complete itself, the bowl emerging not from the craftsman's will, imposed on a passive material, but from a conversation between them in which the material has full standing. There is effort in this. The craftsman's hands are not still, but the effort has dissolved into a kind of attention so absorbed that it no longer feels like effort from the inside, and from the outside it no longer looks like work. The Tao Te Ching holds this quality up throughout its 81 chapters, circling it from different angles, pressing it into different materials to see the impression it makes. Water is the most sustained image. In the chapter that opens with the statement that nothing in the world is as soft and yielding as water, Lao Tzu completes the observation by noting that for the work of dissolving what is hard and inflexible, nothing in the world can match it. The hardest stone yields, eventually, to water, not because water attacks the stone, because water persists without effort, without agenda, wearing the stone by doing exactly what water does, flowing, filling, finding the lowest channel, arriving and arriving and arriving without ever deciding to. That chapter is making a claim at 3 levels simultaneously. At the first level, it is a description of water. At the second level, it is a characterization of the person who has found the way of Wu Wei, supple, persistent, without force, wearing down resistance, not through confrontation, but through the patient continuity of their own nature. At the third level, it is a cosmological statement about what kind of force actually shapes the world across the long arc of time. All 3 levels are present at once, and the teaching moves most clearly when all 3 are held together. There is a passage in the Tao Te Ching that has the quality of a riddle and the quality of a plain statement at the same time. Practice non-action, it says, and nothing is left undone. In Chinese, Wei Wu Wei, Ze Wu Bu Wei. The paradox sits on the surface because non-action and nothing undone appear to cancel each other. But the paradox dissolves when the statement is understood, not as a logical proposition, but as an observation about how transformation actually happens in the world. The river does not decide to carve the canyon. The canyon is simply what happens when water flows downward through stone for long enough. The river practiced non-action. It was simply continuously, precisely itself, and the canyon happened. What gets left undone, Lao Tzu is suggesting, is not the work. What gets left undone is the forcing, the anxious intervention, the muscular override of conditions that are already moving in a direction, if only the person watching could stop trying to push them into a different one. This is the point at which the teaching can most easily be mistaken for a spiritual instruction to relax, to let go, to trust the universe, in the language of a later era. That is not the instruction. The sailor on the flat-bottomed riverboat, one hand on the rudder, watching the surface for the shift in the current's color that will tell him where the channel deepens, that sailor is not relaxed in any ordinary sense of the word. Every thread of attention is engaged. The stillness of his body is not the stillness of someone who has stopped caring. It is the stillness of someone whose caring has become so concentrated that it no longer needs to express itself through visible effort. The boat moves, the river receives it, the rudder makes its small corrections. And from the bank, if anyone is watching, the whole thing looks like nothing much is happening. That quality, the governing that looks like nothing, the doing that looks like not doing, extends into Lao Tzu's thinking about leadership in ways that would have seemed strange to the rulers of his era, and that still seem strange to certain conventions of political thinking today. The fourth ranking in his catalog of rulers is the one who is despised, who governs through cruelty and fear. The third is the one who is feared, but not hated. The second is the one who is loved and praised. These three kinds of rulers are all in their different ways visible. The governed know who is governing. The hand on the reins is felt. The ruler Lao Tzu places at the summit of this catalog is the one the governed barely know exists. When this ruler's work is done and the project completed, the people say, "We did this ourselves." Not because the ruler has tricked them into believing something false, but because the governance was so well aligned with the natural movement of the community, so much with the grain of what was needed, rather than an imposition of what was wanted, that it did not need to announce itself. It happened the way the river happens. The direction was found, not forced, and the directed people, carried forward by something they barely noticed, arrived where they were going and called it their own momentum. This is not a political fantasy. It is a description of the rarest kind of effective action, the kind that does not leave the mark of effort on the world it moves through, the kind that is recognized when it is recognized at all, only in retrospect, when someone looks back at what was accomplished and finds no single hand they can point to. Lao Tzu had seen enough of its opposite to know the difference. He had sat in the Zhou archives and read the records of courts that had managed themselves with increasingly visible force, rites elaborated into performance, rituals shored up by the coercive weight of the state, the continuous, expensive machinery of a civilization trying to hold its shape through the exercise of will. He had watched the effort it required. He had seen what it cost, and he had understood in the particular way that long and patient watching produces understanding, that the effort was itself the problem, that the more clearly a civilization needed to enforce its order, the more clearly the order had already ceased to be natural. A village in a territory with this quality of governance simply goes about its morning. A woman draws water from the well, unhurried. Two men on a rooftop work at a repair, talking as they go. Children move along the path with bundles on their backs, their errands unremarkable and complete. No one in that scene is thinking about the ruler. No one has needed to. The The life of the village has its own momentum, moving in the channels that daily habit and mutual care have worn over generations, and what flows through those channels asks nothing of anyone watching. That image, quiet as it is, carries the political weight of everything Lao Tzu was arguing against. Not because the village is ideal in some sentimental way, but because the life in it is moving according to its own nature, ungoverned in all the ways that matter most, held in shape not by the visible pressure of authority, but by the accumulated, unremarkable momentum of people living close to what they are. The quality the teaching points toward, in water, in the craftsman, in the invisible ruler, in the villagers moving through their ordinary morning, has a single common property. Each of them has found the channel that circumstances have already opened, and has moved through it without trying to make the channel something different. The water does not prefer a particular course. The craftsman's hands do not impose a predetermined shape on the clay. The invisible ruler does not substitute personal ambition for the genuine needs of the governed. The villagers are not performing the idea of a harmonious community. They are simply living in the only way that daily life can sustain itself without the exhausting intervention of force. And this, circling back toward the river, is what makes Wu Wei something other than an argument for passivity. Passivity removes itself from the conditions. Wu Wei enters conditions more deeply than any effort-driven engagement could manage. The difference is in the quality of attention, not the quantity. Less doing, but more presence. Less forcing, but more contact with the actual shape of what is. There is a moment on any river that rewards watching. The place where two currents meet, a side channel rejoining the main flow after a fallen tree has divided the water for some stretch of its path. The reunion is not turbulent or not for long. The two volumes of water arrive at the confluence from slightly different angles, and for a short distance they run side by side, their boundary visible as a thin rope of agitation on the surface. Then that boundary dissolves. The water that was in two channels is in one, and the joining has happened without any part of the water having changed its nature to make room for the other. Each current simply continued moving according to what it was, and the confluence was the natural consequence. There is something in that image that the Tao Te Ching returns to in different forms throughout its chapters. The idea that the world's movements, when not obstructed by the imposition of a will that wants conditions to be other than they are, tend toward confluence rather than collision. Not because conflict is impossible. The river has its turbulences. The water breaks white over stone. The surface is not always smooth. But because the ground current, underneath all the surface disturbance, is moving in one direction, and what aligns itself with that movement finds, in time, that very little is working against it. The sage, in the Tao Te Ching, is the figure who has found that alignment. Not through heroic effort, not through the accumulation of virtuous qualities deliberately cultivated, not through the performance of wisdom in front of an audience. Through a long process of attending, of watching, of putting down the need to make things other than they are, until what remains is a person whose responses to conditions have become as natural and as effortless as the current's response to the stone. That process of putting down is not a single event. It is not an insight that arrives and settles the question. It is more like the way water wears stone, gradual, repetitive, requiring no dramatic gesture, leaving behind it something smoother than it found. The craftsman's hands do not become skilled through an act of will. They become skilled through the accumulation of thousands of small contacts with material, each one slightly more informed by what the material actually is, rather than what the craftsman initially assumed. And at some point in that long apprenticeship, something shifts. The effort is still there, but it has changed its quality. What was straining is now attending. What was forcing is now listening. Lao Tzu does not prescribe a method for arriving at this shift in the way that certain later traditions would prescribe methods. He describes the quality of what is found when the arriving happens. He returns to the images that carry that quality: water, the valley, the uncarved block, the empty hub, the invisible governor, and lets the images do the work that instruction cannot do. Because instruction, by its nature, is still a kind of forcing. The teacher who tells the student exactly what to do has already made an assumption about what the student needs that may or may not be correct. The river does not instruct the stone in how to yield. What the Tao Te Ching offers, instead, is a sustained quality of attention directed at things that already know how to do what they do. The water already knows how to move. The valley already knows how to receive. The craftsman's hands, given enough time and enough honest contact with the clay, already know how to listen. The teaching is not a set of steps toward a destination. It is a way of sitting beside the river long enough that something in the watching begins to resemble something in the water. On an ancient Chinese river, in the late afternoon light, when the surface holds both the sky above and the trees along the bank, a flat-bottomed boat moves downstream. The man in the stern is not young. His hand on the rudder does not move much. He is watching the water in the way that comes from years of watching, not looking for anything in particular, not trying to find the best line through the current, but simply open to what the current is already showing him. A slight darkening 20 meters ahead, where the channel deepens, a riffling at the edge that marks a shallow crossing toward the bank, a surface disturbance too slight and too brief to name that tells him something about the wind coming from the west. His adjustments, when they come, are small: a tilt, a release, a slight increase in the pressure of his hand that corrects the boat's drift without announcing itself as a correction. The boat moves through the afternoon as though the river has chosen this direction, which it has. He is simply traveling the direction the river has chosen, making himself as easy a passage as possible for both of them. There is no drama in this, no visible mastery. From the bank, if anyone were watching, he would appear to be doing almost nothing, an old man with his hand on a stick, letting a river carry him. The boat moving as boats move on rivers, the afternoon continuing. And yet what is happening in that boat requires everything the man has learned about water, about light, about the language of surfaces that indicate what is happening below them. It requires an attention so continuously present that it has passed through the stage of effort and become something else, a quality of contact with conditions that does not distinguish between the man and the river he is traveling. He is the boat's adjustment and the current's reception simultaneously. The movement is not his alone, and it is not the river's alone. It is the natural consequence of two things that have, over the course of an afternoon, found their alignment. That alignment is what the teaching points toward. Not the boat alone, not the river alone. The relationship between them, when the relationship is allowed to be what it actually is, rather than what either party might prefer. The afternoon light on the water holds still in the way that moving water can appear to hold still, when watched long enough, the surface always changing, the particular configuration of light and current never exactly repeated, but something in the pattern continuous enough that the eye rests rather than works. The trees on the bank pass. The distant mountains neither approach nor recede in any way that is easy to mark. The boat moves at the speed of the current, which is the speed that requires no negotiation. a word that appears in the Tao Te Ching alongside Wu Wei, and that carries much of the same quality, is ziran, natural, spontaneous, self-so. The character itself suggests something that is so of itself, without external cause or intervention, a tree that grows toward light, not because it was instructed to, but because that is what trees do when they are allowed to do what trees do. Ziran, in this sense, is not the opposite of deliberate action. It is what deliberate action tends toward when it has been practiced long enough that the deliberation drops away, and what remains is the action itself, clean and unrehearsed, arising from the nature of the situation rather than from the overlay of calculation. The sage who governs with Wu Wei is not a person who has stopped thinking. The sage has thought long enough, attended carefully enough, that thinking has become something that happens at the speed of conditions rather than behind them. The response arrives as the conditions arrive, not as a formula applied to a situation, but as the natural shape that the situation itself calls forth. The way the river finds the canyon in the stone, not by planning, but by being precisely itself in the presence of precisely these conditions. The boulder in the river does not yield in a single encounter. The water moves past it today and tomorrow and for 1,000 years, and each encounter is so small as to be invisible to any watching done on the scale of a human life. But the encounters accumulate. The stone is carried, grain by grain, downstream. The upstream face, where the water arrives, is rounder now than it was when the first spring thaw brought it to this place in the stream bed. The river has done this without intention, without effort, without the kind of doing that announces itself as doing. This is the longest argument in the Tao Te Ching, sustained across dozens of chapters by image and observation and the patient return to water, to emptiness, to the valley that holds everything without holding anything back. The argument is not made in the way a treatise makes an argument: premise, development, conclusion, a clear line of reasoning that can be summarized and tested. It is made the way a river makes an argument, by flowing, by finding its channels, by letting the shape it wears in stone speak for itself over time, which means that it cannot be fully held in a single reading. It cannot be grasped in the way that a logical proposition can be grasped, turned over, confirmed or denied. It can only be sat with, returned to, carried in the way that water carries something, not by gripping it, but by surrounding it completely, finding its weight and its buoyancy, and moving with it at the speed conditions allow. Outside, wherever the night has gathered itself, something is moving in the dark that has not been asked to. A creek along a hillside, or a slow river through a valley, or the barely perceptible seep of groundwater through porous stone, working by gradients too gentle to see, finding its way downward by the only law it knows, which is also the only law it needs. The water does not know the name of the sea it is moving toward. It moves because movement is what water does, in the presence of the small but sufficient angle of inclination, in the patient dark, no one watching, no witness required. The water arriving where it arrives without needing the arrival to be witnessed. It has been moving this way for longer than the oldest record, longer than the earliest story told about a man on a water buffalo moving west, longer than the first hand that pressed a brush dipped in ink into the character for water and let the strokes fall into the shape of something flowing. Long before the teaching was given a name, water was already demonstrating it. Long before anyone understood that the softness of water was a form of power, the water was wearing the stone. The river does not carry this knowledge. It simply is this knowledge, enacted continuously, offered to anyone patient enough to watch without asking it to be something else, moving through the valley in the dark as it has always moved, as it will continue to move long after the last eye that watched it has closed, still flowing, finding the lowest channel, arriving without effort at wherever it arrives. On one side of a hillside, in late afternoon, the light still holds. On the other side, shadow has already arrived, moving slowly across the rock face, like something patient that has been waiting for the warmth to recede. A person standing at the edge of that line, 1 foot in gold, 1 in gray, would not be able to say exactly where one becomes the other. The line moves. It has always been moving, and the hillside, which contains both, does not appear to notice the contradiction. It simply stands, receiving what the day gives it, holding the dark and the bright in one body without effort and without strain. This is where certain early Taoist thinkers like to stand and look, not to study the shadow or catalog the light, but to notice that the world, left entirely to itself, arranges these things without anyone's assistance. The shadow and the light are not fighting. Neither is trying to win. They are completing each other in a way that requires both to be present, and when one advances, the other simply makes room. The Tao Te Ching holds this observation at its center, not as a poetic flourish, but as a description of how things actually are. The interplay of what appears to be opposites, the yielding and the firm, the full and the empty, the moving and the still, is not, in Lao Tzu's understanding, a problem awaiting resolution. It is the living pulse of things. It is what being itself does when no one is trying to simplify it. There is a word for these paired, complementary forces that move through all things, yin and yang. The word arrives last because the experience of them should arrive first. The shadow and the light, the breath in and the breath out, the sound and the silence that makes the sound audible. The words yin and yang do not create the pairing. They name something already present in the texture of every ordinary day, something the body knows before the mind has given it a category. Yin is not the enemy of yang. Yang is not trying to overcome yin. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about them, and also the thing most easily forgotten when the mind reaches for simple stories about how forces work. The ancient cosmological picture that emerges from Taoist thought is not a story of conflict between opposing sides. It is a picture of polarity, the way a musical note and its silence make sound possible, the way a mountain's height is inseparable from the depth of the valley below it, the way the inhalation would mean nothing without the body's willingness to release. Each contains the seed of the other. This is the detail the symbol carries, the small circle of darkness within the white field, the small circle of light within the dark field, because nothing in this account ever becomes purely itself without already holding the beginning of its return. The yang, at its fullest expression, is already tipping toward yin. The yin, at its deepest, is already gathering what will become yang again. The cycle does not have a starting point. It has always been turning, and it does not turn because something is pushing it. It turns because that is what the nature of things does. Lao Tzu returned to this understanding in many different ways across the 81 chapters of the text he left behind. He came at it from the direction of water and stone, of the ruler and the ruled, of life and death, of the tree and the storm. The forms changed. The observation beneath them remained steady. What appears to oppose one another is looked at closely enough, what sustains one another. In the second chapter of the Tao Te Ching, the observation takes this form. When people see some things as beautiful, other things become ugly. This is not a complaint about human perception, and it is not a counsel to stop noticing beauty. It is something more precise than that. Lao Tzu is pointing to the relational nature of all the categories the mind uses to organize experience, the way that beautiful and ugly, good and bad, long and short, high and low are not descriptions of properties that belong to things in isolation, but descriptions that arise in relationship, each one requiring the other to exist at all. Long is only long beside short, high is only high above what is low. This seems, stated plainly, almost too obvious to be interesting, but the observation, held longer, opens into something less obvious. If all value concepts are relational in this way, if they arise as pairs, each dependent on the other for its own intelligibility, then the person who chases only beauty, refusing ugliness entirely, is not making their experience more beautiful. They are chasing something that cannot exist in pure form, because it is constituted by the very thing they are trying to leave behind. The sage that the Tao Te Ching describes moves differently, not by refusing to prefer, not by pretending that all things are the same, but by holding the whole polarity lightly, making no absolute claims, grasping after no fixed possession, and moving through the world in contact with the wholeness that underlies apparent division. This is a difficult thing to make felt in words, because words are themselves part of the naming that the Tao Te Ching treats with such care and such caution. To say it in the simplest available terms, the sage does not get tangled in the movement between poles, because the sage knows that both poles are expressions of a single living thing, the way both sides of the breath are expressions of a single breathing body. A willow tree by a riverbank understands this with its whole body, without having understood anything at all. In the 22nd chapter of the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu writes that what yields is preserved. The willow bends. It bends in ways that look, from a certain distance, like defeat. Branches swept horizontal, nearly touching the water, trembling in a wind that a harder tree would resist. And then the gust passes, and the willow returns upright, having lost nothing, having given nothing away, having simply accommodated a force it could not stop, and allowed it to move through. The image from the 76th chapter is more explicit. A living tree is flexible and supple. A dead tree is dry and rigid. Lao Tzu is not making a metaphor here, or not only a metaphor. He is making an observation about what life actually is when it is working, a quality of responsiveness, of capacity to yield without breaking, of suppleness that is not weakness, but the condition of survival. And he is pointing out that what the culture of his time, what most cultures, most of the time calls strength, the quality of hardness and resistance and firm refusal to yield, is actually a description of something closer to death than to life. This is a reorientation of an idea so fundamental that it takes time to settle. Strength understood as hardness, as unyielding resistance to pressure, as the capacity to remain unchanged, this is actually brittleness. The oak across the river that did not bend in the storm is not there anymore. Its rigidity was not strength. It was the incapacity to move with what came, and that incapacity is what broke it. The willow that yielded is still there in the morning, standing in the water's edge, its branches gathering light. Nothing about it looks defeated. Everything about it looks alive. The quality Lao Tzu points toward, the suppleness, the yielding, the capacity to move with rather than against, is not submission or passivity in any ordinary sense. It is a deeply active quality. It requires a kind of ongoing attentiveness to what is actually happening, a willingness to feel the direction of the force and release into it rather than harden against it. This is harder to do than hardening in most circumstances, because hardening is a single motion and releasing is a continuous one. The river bank at the edge of a storm is a good place to hold this idea. The water does not decide to accommodate the wind's direction. It simply does what water does, which is find the path available to it, move through whatever opening exists, fill whatever hollow presents itself, give way wherever giving way allows it to continue moving. It does not plan this. It does not deliberate. It has, in Lao Tzu's account, a kind of wisdom that is prior to deliberation, the wisdom of something that has not been divided from its own nature, and in the yielding it is preserved. In the constant accommodation, it continues. The image of the wheel returns here, because the wheel holds this teaching in a form that can be seen and touched. 30 spokes meet at a hub. The hub is empty, a hollow space through which the axle passes, and it is this hollowness, this nothing, that allows the wheel to turn. Without the emptiness at the center, the spokes would be a solid mass of wood, and the cart would go nowhere. This is chapter 11 of the Tao Te Ching, and what it says very carefully is that form and emptiness are not enemies, they are complements. They require each other the way the sound requires the silence around it, the way the shore requires the water that is not land. The empty hub does not wish it were full. The full rim does not wish it were hollow. Each is what it is, and what each is turns out to be the necessary condition for the other to function. The philosophical weight of this image, held long enough, is considerable. It says something about what it means for a thing to work, to function, to be capable of use, and life and movement. What allows function is not the accumulated density of what is there, but the particular relationship between what is there and what is absent. The room is useful not because of the walls, but because of the space the walls enclose. The bowl serves not because of the clay, but because of the hollow the clay has been shaped around. The wheel turns not because of the wood, but because of the nothing at its center. Yin and yang, again, each present everywhere, each necessary. The apparent nothing, looked at carefully, is doing some of the most essential work. There is a contemplative practice, described in the 16th chapter of the Tao Te Ching, that holds all of this, the duality, the return, the oscillation of things between their poles, in the form of an instruction, though instruction is not quite the right word. It is more like an invitation to notice something that is already happening. The chapter counsels a return to the root. It describes a practitioner who sits in stillness and watches the 10,000 things, the vast multiplicity of the world's particular forms, its creatures and seasons and events rise and fall, and return to the source, return to the root. The image the chapter uses for this return is the image of the 10,000 things returning to their root, as plants return in autumn, not being destroyed, not being punished, but completing a motion that the rising was always the first half of. The going out was always going to turn back. The movement was always going to become stillness again, and the stillness is not the end, but the ground, the place from which the next movement will begin, as it has always begun, as it will always begin, as long as there is something rather than nothing. What the practitioner is being invited to notice, sitting quietly in this passage, is that stillness is not the absence of movement. It is the root of movement. It is what movement comes from and what movement returns to. The river at night, between its currents, holds a stillness that is the very ground of its flowing. The hillside in the moments before dawn, before the shadow and the light begin their daily exchange, holds a stillness that is not emptiness, but readiness, the ground poised to receive whatever the turning of the earth brings next. To return to the root is not to stop. It is to find the place from which everything moves, the still center around which the motion organizes itself, the hub, the hollow, the empty room that receives whatever light the day decides to offer. A musician knows this, or comes to know it. The ancient Chinese zither, the guqin, produces sounds that require silence to be heard. This is true of every instrument, but the guqin's tones are particularly brief, particularly present in their decay, particularly aware of the air around them. A player who has been playing for a long time learns to listen to the silence between notes with the same quality of attention brought to the notes themselves, because the silence is not emptiness. It is the continuation of the sound inward, the place where the note goes when it stops being audible, the readiness in the air before the next note arrives. In that pause between notes, both sounds are present, the one that has just ended, still sounding inwardly as the body continues to receive it, and the one about to begin, already existing as a kind of tensed readiness in the player's hand and the listening ear. The silence is not nothing. It is the living tissue between two moments of form, and it makes both moments possible in a way that a continuous sound, uninterrupted, never could. This is yin and yang at the scale of music, not fighting, not in tension, but completing each other so precisely that removing either one would eliminate both. The sound without the silence is just noise. The silence without the sound is just absence. Together they are music, which is something neither of them is alone. Lao Tzu understood the world this way, not as a collection of individual things with fixed natures, but as an unceasing conversation between complementary forces, each giving the other its definition, each moving into the other in a rhythm that has no beginning and will have no end. The Tao itself, in this understanding, is not separate from the dance. The Tao is the dancing, and the sage in this picture is not someone who has mastered the dance from outside it. The sage is someone who has stopped trying to stand apart from it, stopped trying to hold the yin and refuse the yang, stopped trying to keep the light and prevent the shadow. The sage is someone who has returned to the root of the thing and found that the root is not any particular position, but the capacity to move through all positions without being broken by any of them. There is a quality of attention that comes with this, not the sharp, effortful attention of someone solving a problem, but something softer and wider. The attention of someone sitting at the base of a mountain in early morning, watching mist rise from the valley below, noticing the way the mist forms where the cold air meets the warm, noticing that it is neither the cold nor the warm, but the meeting of them that produces this hovering, luminous presence above the valley floor. The mist is the product of two conditions meeting. Neither condition could produce it alone. The cold needs the warm needs the cold, and what they produce together, this soft, white, slowly rising thing that is neither solid nor liquid, neither the ground nor the sky, is something that belongs to both of them and to neither of them, a third thing that only exists in the meeting. The person sitting at the mountain's base watches this without needing to resolve it into simpler terms. The mist does not need to be explained to be beautiful. It does not need to be categorized as primarily a product of the cold or primarily a product of the warm. It simply is what it is, which is a thing that two complementary conditions have made together, and it will continue to be this thing for as long as the morning holds both conditions in the right relationship. There is something in this that the word harmony carries, though the word arrives last because the experience of it should arrive first. Harmony is not the elimination of difference. Harmony is what happens when different things find the relationship to one another that allows each to be fully what it is, in the presence of the others, without any of them being diminished. The hillside holds the shadow and the light in harmony. The music holds the sound and the silence in harmony. The storm holds the wind and the willow in harmony, though it takes a wider view to see it, a view that includes what comes after the storm, the willow still standing, the air cleared, the river running a little faster with the new rain. The harmony the Tao Te Ching points toward is not a static thing. It is not the harmony of things that have been arranged properly and will now stay in their places. It is the harmony of things in motion together, the harmony of the tide that comes in and goes out, the harmony of the breath moving through its cycle, the harmony of the morning that becomes the afternoon, that becomes the evening, that returns to morning. It is a harmony that requires time, that exists in time, that is constituted by the movement between poles, rather than by arrival at any single pole. This is perhaps the most disorienting thing the Tao Te Ching asks of the mind that tries to follow it, to let go of the idea that harmony is a destination, a fixed arrangement that the world is trying to arrive at, and that wisdom consists in helping it arrive. The Tao Te Ching suggests something different. It suggests that the world is already in harmony, in the deepest sense, because the world is already moving the way things move when they are not being forced, the way the shadow moves across the hillside, the way the willow bends in the storm, the way the mist rises from the valley in the morning cold. What appears to be disorder, from close up, is often simply a part of the cycle that has not yet completed its motion. The storm is not disharmony. The dying tree is not disharmony. The advancing shadow is not the elimination of the light. These things are part of the turn, part of the conversation between complementary forces, part of the living pulse of a world that has always been both things at once. An empty room at midday receives light from a window on its far wall. The light does not fill the room in the way that water fills a vessel. It travels across the room's open space and illuminates not the walls, but the dust moving in the air between them. The room is most visibly itself in the space it has kept empty. The emptiness is not the absence of the room. It is the room's capacity to hold light, to make light visible, to give the light somewhere to arrive. This is the quality that yin offers yang, and that yang offers yin. Each one provides the other with somewhere to arrive. Each one makes the other visible. The sound makes the silence audible as silence. The silence makes the sound audible as sound. The shadow makes the light visible as light. The light makes the shadow visible as shadow. Remove one, and you have not gained the purity of the other. You have lost both. The Tao Te Ching does not state this as a philosophical position to be argued and defended. It observes it, the way a person who has been sitting still for a long time observes the room they are in, with the particular quality of attention that comes when the trying has stopped and the noticing has begun. This is the philosophical register the text works in, not argument, but attention, not proof, but observation, offered slowly from many different angles in the hope that something will eventually be seen that cannot easily be unseen. And what might be seen, if the attention holds long enough, is that the paired complementary nature of things is not a problem to be solved. It is not a sign that the world is incomplete or that human understanding is insufficient. It is the shape of reality at its most vivid and alive, the shape of something that has not been simplified, flattened, or forced into a single pole. The shadow needs the light needs the shadow, and the hillside that holds both of them, without argument, without preference, without the slightest effort to be anything other than a hillside receiving the afternoon. The hillside is already wise in the way that things are wise before wisdom has been given a name. Chapter 16 returns to the image of return, and it is worth resting there for a moment, not because the chapter resolves anything, but because it offers a kind of stillness. The 10,000 things rise and fall, Lao Tzu writes. They flourish, and each returns to the root. Returning to the root is called stillness, and this stillness is called returning to one's destiny. This is not fatalism. It is not a counsel to stop. It is a description of the motion itself, the motion that everything participates in, that everything has always been participating in. Rising, falling, returning. The root that receives the return is not empty in the way an abandoned place is empty. It is full in the way that a field in winter is full, holding, quietly, everything that will rise from it in the spring. To know this, to know it not as a piece of information, but as a felt understanding, the way the body knows the rhythm of the breath, is what the Tao Te Ching seems to be working toward across all 81 of its chapters. Not a doctrine, not a system, a quality of seeing that makes the movement of things feel, for the first time, like exactly what they should be doing. A field in winter is resting in the way that the practitioner in chapter 16 is resting, not absent, not finished, but returned to the root, gathered into the stillness from which the next movement will eventually come. A farmer who knows the field knows this. The farmer does not look at the bare ground in winter and see absence. The farmer sees potential, held, patient, unhurried, waiting for the conditions that will call it forward again. The yin holds the yang. The stillness holds the motion. The root holds the 10,000 things that are, even now, slowly, invisibly preparing to rise again. The dust in the empty room catches the afternoon light and drifts, slowly, without direction, through the air the room has been holding all day. Neither the dust nor the light chose this moment. Neither arranged to be here at this particular angle, at this particular hour, in this particular quality of late afternoon gold. It simply happened the way things happen when they are not being prevented, the way the shadow advances across the rock face, the way the mist gathers above the warm earth, the way the willow bends and then stands again. The light will move across the floor and then leave, and the room will hold the dark quietly as it held the light, without clutching either, without mourning the one that left, or grasping for the one that has not yet arrived. The room simply remains what it is, an empty space capable of receiving whatever the day brings. This is not indifference. This is the deep receptivity that Lao Tzu placed at the center of things, the quality of the valley that receives all sounds, the quality of the water that flows to the lowest place, the quality of the root that receives the returning. Night deepens on the hillside. The shadow, which has been advancing since mid-afternoon, has now covered the whole slope. The light has retreated, but it has not gone. It has simply moved, as it always moves, to the other side of the turn, held in reserve, already preparing its return in the morning, already positioned to begin the same slow advance from the opposite direction when the earth has completed its rotation. The shadow is not victory. The light is not defeat, neither is asking the other to apologize for existing. The tide that moved far out today is already moving quietly back. It makes no announcement. It meets no resistance except the gentle slope of sand that has always been there, patient as the root, waiting for the water's return. The foam at the leading edge of the wave spreads itself thin across the wet sand, reaches as far as it can, and then without struggle, without reluctance, draws back, becoming the receding edge of the wave behind it, which is already becoming the advancing edge of the wave that follows. Every movement carries within it the seed of its own return. The crest of the wave contains the trough. The breath held it full contains the beginning of the release. The yang at its fullest tips toward yin. The yin at its deepest gathers what will rise into yang again. And the turning itself, this endless, unhurried exchange between complementary poles, is not something that needs to be managed or corrected or helped along. It is what the world does. It is, in the oldest and deepest sense available in this tradition, the way. The hillside holds its shadow in the dark, waiting for nothing, needing nothing, moving toward the morning at the pace of the earth's own turning, which is the only pace there has ever been, and which is, if anything, the pace of rest. Confucius arrived at the Zhou archives in the formal dress of a man who believed that precision of appearance was the beginning of precision of mind. His robes were arranged correctly. His manner was composed. He had traveled to the capital because he had heard that a keeper of records lived there who possessed knowledge of antiquity that no one else in the known world had assembled, and Confucius wanted that knowledge the way a serious man wants anything, with a kind of organized hunger, with preparation, with the intention of putting what he received to careful use. The archive itself was a long, low building, its shelves stacked from floor to ceiling with rolled documents in lacquered cases, the oldest of them worn at the ends where generations of scholars had unrolled and re-rolled them. The smell of the place was specific, old silk and dried ink, and the particular must of wood that has absorbed many seasons without being touched by rain. Confucius would have noticed the smell. He noticed most things. What he was less prepared for was the man who came to meet him, old, unhurried, with the quality of stillness that belongs to someone who has long since stopped needing the room to rearrange itself in his favor. What Lao Tzu said to him that day, no one can know with certainty. Sima Chan recorded a version of the meeting, and the Zhuangzi contains its own account, and neither text was written by anyone who was there. What comes through both accounts, across the centuries of copying and commentary and translation that separate that meeting from this moment, is the shape of what happened, that an earnest, careful man arrived with organized questions and left with something he had not expected, something that did not fit the category of knowledge he had come to acquire. Confucius walked back to his disciples afterward and told them that Lao Tzu was like a dragon. A dragon, he said, rides the clouds and the wind. A dragon cannot be caught or measured or fully understood. He had met scholars who were predictable in their difficulty, whose challenges could be answered with enough preparation. He had not, before that afternoon, met someone who seemed to have stepped partially out of the human project of needing to be anywhere in particular. That sentence, Lao Tzu is like a dragon, was spoken aloud in the open air to a small group of students on a road outside the capital, and it has not stopped moving since. What troubled Confucius, in the way the best ideas trouble a serious mind, was not simply what Lao Tzu had said, but the ground it called into question. Confucius had built his life on the conviction that the careful, deliberate cultivation of virtue, of ritual, of propriety, of the named moral qualities that held society together, was the highest work a human being could undertake. He believed that by studying the rites of the ancient kings, by practicing the correct forms of mourning and ceremony and address, a person could become genuinely good, and that a society of genuinely good people, led by genuinely good rulers, was the closest approximation to human flourishing that the world could produce. Lao Tzu looked at this project with something that was neither contempt nor indifference. It was more like the attention of someone who has read the end of a particular kind of story many times and knows with a certain quietness how it tends to arrive. In the 38th chapter of the Tao Te Ching, there is a passage that moves through a descending sequence. When the Tao is lost, there is virtue. When virtue is lost, there is benevolence. When benevolence is lost, there is righteousness. When righteousness is lost, there is ritual. Ritual, in this account, is not the foundation of the good society. Ritual is what remains when the deeper things have already gone. For Confucius, this was not a small objection. It was a challenge to the entire architecture of what he was building. If the named virtues, benevolence, righteousness, propriety, were signs of decline rather than signs of health, then the project of deliberately cultivating them was not the cure, but a symptom of the very illness it was attempting to treat. Lao Tzu was not saying that kindness was bad. He was saying something stranger and in its way more demanding, that a society in which kindness needs to be named and taught and practiced as a discipline has already moved some distance from the natural harmony in which genuine goodness moves without being noticed or identified. This is the place where Lao Tzu's thinking reaches its sharpest edge, not in the mystical passages about the formless source of all things, not in the images of water wearing away stone, but here in the claim that the very act of naming a virtue as a virtue is a kind of wound in the fabric of the natural order. When people see some things as beautiful, the Tao Te Ching says in its second chapter, other things become ugly. The categories themselves are the problem. The labels are not pointing at permanent features of reality. They are drawing lines in something that, before the lines were drawn, was continuous. Confucius heard this and did not dismiss it. He was not the kind of thinker who dismissed what he could not immediately answer. He turned it over, the way a craftsman turns an object to find where it is weakest, and he carried it away with him. Whether he ever resolved it is another question. The two visions, one saying that deliberate cultivation is the only path, one saying that deliberate cultivation is itself the departure from the path, have been held in tension for more than 2,000 years without either one winning. They are still held in tension. That tension is not a failure of the tradition. It is the tradition thinking carefully in two honest directions at once. The man who extended Lao Tzu's thinking most exuberantly and most strangely was not a court official or a keeper of archives, but a figure named Zhuangzi, who lived perhaps a century after the composition of the Tao Te Ching, and who brought to the same philosophical ground a quality of imagination that is almost impossible to describe without resorting to the kind of superlatives the style guide forbids. Call it instead a quality of absolute seriousness about the absurd, a willingness to carry a philosophical argument into territory that makes even the argument look small, and to do this not as a provocation, but as an act of genuine inquiry into what happens when you follow a question far enough. Zhuangzi once dreamed he was a butterfly, not as a metaphor, as a fact of his sleeping life, documented. He dreamed he was a butterfly, and in the dream he was the butterfly completely, with no awareness of being a man who was dreaming of being a butterfly. He was simply a butterfly, moving in the light, and then he woke, and there he was, Zhuangzi, a man lying on his sleeping mat, with the memory of flight still in some part of his body. That memory does not usually inhabit. The question he asked afterward was this: am I a man who has just woken from dreaming he was a butterfly, or am I a butterfly now dreaming that I am a man? The question sounds like wordplay. It is not wordplay. It is a precisely aimed instrument directed at something very specific, the assumption that there is a fixed, stable, continuous thing called Zhuangzi, a self with clear edges, an identity that moves through time without transformation, and that this self is primary, and the butterfly was merely a dream. Zhuangzi looked at that assumption with great seriousness and noticed that he had no way from inside either state to confirm it. In the dream, there was no Zhuangzi. The there was only the butterfly. If identity is what it feels like from the inside, then both were equally real, and the waking state has no philosophical privilege over the dreaming one simply because it calls itself waking. What the Tao does, in Zhuangzi's understanding, is move through all of this, through the man and the butterfly, through the waking and the dreaming, through every identity and every transformation as the single process of which all particular identities are temporary expressions. He had a word for this movement, hua, transformation. Not the transformation of one thing into another, as if the thing itself remains constant while its surface changes, but a deeper, more complete passage in which the very distinction between the man and the butterfly is dissolved in the larger flow of the process that generates both. Zhuangzi, sitting on the edge of his sleeping mat, holding that question in his hands, the way one holds water, not gripping, not releasing, simply feeling the weight of it and the way it moves between the fingers, is one of the enduring images in the history of human thought. Not because it resolves anything, because it does not resolve anything, and holds its irresolution with such composure that the irresolution begins to feel like the most honest available position. Some philosophers, when they reach a question they cannot answer, treat it as a temporary failure, a gap to be closed by more careful thinking. Zhuangzi looked at this question and seemed to find the gap itself instructive. The gap was the teaching. The not knowing was the nearest thing to knowing that the situation permitted. This is what it means to hold a position with philosophical seriousness rather than as a performance of wisdom. Zhuangzi was not showing off the butterfly dream. He was genuinely uncertain, and he knew that his genuine uncertainty pointed at something about the nature of identity that all the certainties on either side of it could not reach. The Tao Te Ching's full title is 4 characters in classical Chinese, Tao Te Ching. The first word Tao is the one the tradition has spent 2,500 years circling without capturing. The second word is Te. It is the one that tends to receive less attention, and the inattention is a small loss, because Te is where the Tao's influence enters the particular. A thing that is fully aligned with the Tao. A tree that grows in the direction light actually falls. A river that finds the lowest channel without being instructed, and a person who acts from their deepest nature without the intervention of performance or self-consciousness. Such a thing possesses Ti, not as a quality it has earned or developed through discipline, but as the natural expression of what it already is, unobstructed. Teppel is often translated as virtue, and the translation is serviceable if one is careful to strip the word of its moral flavor, its sense of praiseworthy adherence to correct principles. The Teppel of the Tao Te Ching is not the virtue of a person who has successfully suppressed their worst impulses. It is more like the virtue of a well-made knife, not a knife that is trying to be sharp, but one whose material and form are so well matched to their purpose that sharpness is simply what it is. The distinction matters because one of these is a project that can be undertaken deliberately, and the other is something that happens when the deliberate projects stop interfering. A sage in Lao Tzu's account possesses Te not by having cultivated it, but by having ceased to obstruct it, by having allowed the natural expression of their deepest nature to move without the constant interruption of the calculating, comparing, socially performing mind that most people take to be the whole of themselves. The sage is not trying to be virtuous. The sage has, through long practice of non-striving, become transparent to the Tao, and what moves through that transparency is what the tradition calls Te, the power, the potency, the intrinsic quality of a being that is not in conflict with its own nature. This is a difficult idea to hold without turning it into another kind of project, another instruction to pursue. Lao Tzu seemed aware of this. Chapter after chapter of the Tao Te Ching circles the same difficulty: how to point toward the natural without making naturalness into a goal, how to describe non-striving without the description becoming an object of striving, how to name the unnamed without naming it to death. The text lives in this difficulty rather than solving it. The text is made of this difficulty. Every verse is a small attempt to gesture towards something that gesturing cannot reach, and the honesty of the gesturing, the willingness to fail at the task in a particular, carefully considered way, is itself a kind of instruction. Long after the Tao Te Ching moved beyond the borders of the philosophical tradition that produced it, its central intuitions found their way into a new form: Chan Buddhism, which arose in China during the centuries when Buddhist practice was encountering and absorbing the existing Chinese philosophical landscape, carried something of the Taoist understanding of naturalness into its own distinctive approach to practice and awakening. The Chan concept of Zanran, which moves toward meaning naturalness, self-sowness, the quality of a thing that happens of itself rather than being made to happen, carried forward what Lao Tzu had named as Wu Wei into a contemplative tradition that would eventually spread across Korea and Japan, and centuries later, much of the world. A monk in a Tang Dynasty Chan monastery rose before dawn to chop wood in the courtyard. The practice was not a metaphor. It was not symbolic of spiritual effort or the splitting of illusion. It was chopping wood, which the monastery needed because mornings were cold. The monk's master had told him many years earlier that before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. The point was not that nothing changes. The point was that the activity is the same, and the relationship to the activity is different, not in a way that can be easily described, but in a way that the person doing it knows, with the specific clarity of a body that is no longer working against itself. The sound of the axe in the cold courtyard at dawn, clean, resonant, complete, was the whole teaching, not a vehicle for the teaching, not a reminder of something else, not a practice in the service of a later, better state, simply the axle turning in the empty hub, the action meeting its object, the morning receiving the sound without commentary. This is what Lao Tzu had pointed at when he described the sage who acts and leaves no trace, who accomplishes without taking credit, who completes the work and moves on. The work is real, the completion is real, the moving on is real. Only the self that insists on being seen to have done it is in the end the part that was never quite as solid as it felt. What travels forward through a tradition is not always what the tradition intends to transmit. The Tao Te Ching was composed, if composed is the right word for something that arrived through a gatekeeper's request at the edge of a civilization, as 81 verses in classical Chinese, each one compressed to the point where translation requires interpretation at almost every step. Every translator makes choices. Every choice admits one reading and forecloses another. By the time the text reaches a reader in a language that shares no grammatical structure with classical Chinese, the reader is holding something that has passed through several layers of careful, fallible attention, each one leaving its own fingerprints on the material. This should be cause for hesitation, and it is, but it is also, in its own way, a demonstration of something the text itself keeps insisting on. The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. Every translation is told. Every told version carries with it the limitations of the telling, the word choices, the grammatical assumptions, the cultural context of the translator, the historical moment in which the rendering was made. And yet something persists. Something continues to move through all these layers of inadequate transmission, the way water continues to move through channels that were not designed for it, finding the available path, carrying what it can. A scholar in Sao Paulo reading one translation tonight, a teacher in Oslo reading another, a student in Nairobi reading a third. The 81 verses moving outward across every boundary they were written to dissolve, arriving in forms Lao Tzu could not have anticipated, in languages that did not exist when the words were first written, being read in rooms he had no way of imagining, people whose lives and difficulties and questions are entirely unlike the lives and difficulties and questions of the people he knew. And still, something in the text meets them, not because the text is universal in some abstract, triumphant sense, but because the questions it is circling are questions that arise wherever there are human beings who have stopped long enough to notice that the world does not quite fit the categories they were given to understand it with. The gap between the name and the named thing, the effort that produces the opposite of what effort intended. The sense that beneath the relentless movement of particular events, something else is happening, something that is not moving in the same direction or at the same pace, something older and more patient and less interested in arriving anywhere. These are not exclusively Chinese questions. They are not the exclusive property of any tradition. They are what tends to emerge when a mind becomes quiet enough to notice what was always there. The river that has been moving through this narration, the one that finds the lowest channel, that yields to every obstacle and in yielding outlasts it, that carries everything lightly and accumulates nothing, that river has been flowing since before the first person named it, before there was a Chinese character for river, before there was anyone standing on its bank to decide whether it was moving quickly or slowly, whether its current was useful or inconvenient. The river was there, doing what water does, following the shape of the land with a patience that makes human patience look brief and strenuous. Lao Tzu chose water as his primary image, not because it was poetically effective, but because it was precisely accurate. Chapter 78 of the Tao Te Ching states it plainly. Nothing in the world is as soft and yielding as water, and yet for dissolving the hard and inflexible, nothing can surpass it. This is not inspirational metaphor. It is a physical claim about the world that anyone who has seen a river canyon can verify. Stone walls worn smooth and curved by centuries of water that had no intention of carving them, that simply moved in the direction gravity indicated and let the result follow from that. The Tao does not carve canyons. The Tao moves, and canyons are what happen over the length of time that human beings are not very good at imagining. What Lao Tzu was pointing at, through the water and the valley and the uncarved block and the empty hub of the wheel, was something about the nature of duration, not the duration of a long life, which is still brief, not the duration of a civilization, which is longer but still brief. The duration of processes that were in motion before any particular thing had a name, and that will continue after every particular name has dissolved back into the silence it came from. The Tao is not going anywhere. It is not building toward anything. It has no destination that it is approaching and no origin that it has moved away from. It is simply what is happening, underneath and within, and through everything that appears to be happening. This can sound like an enormous claim, and in one sense it is. But in another sense, it is the most minimal possible claim that reality, whatever it is, was not waiting for human beings to describe it in order to proceed. The 10,000 things were rising and falling long before there was anyone to count them. The seasons were turning. The rivers were finding their channels. The living and the dying were underway. All of this was happening as it happens now, without annotation or explanation or the requirement that it makes sense in terms that a mind could rest in comfortably. The particular peace that Lao Tzu's philosophy offers is not the peace of having understood. It is the peace of having stopped requiring understanding as the condition of being at rest. The sage in the Tao Te Ching's account does not know more than other people. The sage has, in some deep sense, given up a particular kind of knowing, the kind that requires the world to stay still long enough to be fully named and categorized and filed. What the sage receives in exchange is the capacity to move through a world that will not stay still without the constant friction of resistance to its moving. Zhuangzi described the perfect man as one who does not dream when asleep. This is not an endorsement of dreamlessness as a goal. It is a description of a quality of rest, rest that is so complete, so untroubled by the residue of the day's accumulated worries and calculations and small defeats, that sleep is simply sleep rather than the continuation of wakefulness in another register. The mind that has ceased to grip the world continues, even in sleep, not gripping it. And this quality of release, of allowing the world to be what it is without the constant exertion of the will to make it otherwise, was what the Taoist tradition pointed toward, not as a distant achievement, but as the natural state available when the obstructions are removed. The obstructions in this account are not character flaws to be corrected. They are habits of the mind, habits of comparing and judging and naming and preferring and resisting that have accumulated over a lifetime of living in a world that rewards them. The sage has not eliminated these habits through force of will. The sage has, through long patience and the kind of attention that does not require anything in particular from what it attends to, allowed them to thin and become quieter, the way sediment settles when the water is no longer being stirred. A practice of great age, documented in Chapter 16 of the Tao Te Ching, involves nothing more complicated than sitting still and watching the movement of the 10,000 things, watching without preference, watching the arising and the passing without choosing sides. The flowers bloom, and they are not asked to continue blooming. The leaves fall, and they are not asked to return. The day moves toward the evening at its own pace, and the evening moves toward the dark at its own pace, and the dark is not a problem that the morning is sent to solve. Everything returns to the root. The root is quiet. In the quiet of the root, before the next movement begins, there is something that is not nothing, something that is the condition for everything that follows, the ground that receives everything that returns to it. The philosopher who sat long enough with this understanding found something that did not resolve the questions, but transformed the relationship to them. The question of whether there is a self continued to be unanswerable. The question of what the Tao is continued to slip out of every formulation offered to contain it.